larger history of cooperative movements. Yeah, Laurent's talk is fantastic because it sort of opens our minds and realizes that like, people are doing stuff in Europe. Okay, so the first period of the modern, sort of pre-modern cooperative movement is Owenite cooperation. Robert Owen did a few different things, but what you need to know about Owen for the purpose of the short version of this presentation is he believed that education was really important because people's moral character is formed by their education. So for Owen, education was actually the key to forming a new moral society. So it wasn't just about like educating people how to do like a little bit of business. It was actually about like transforming society. Owen's projects were different versions of setting up cooperative villages. So the first one was this mill he set up at New Lanark, and the second one is this sort of the early hippie commune that he builds in the United States. But the point is that in this context, cooperation means a way of running a whole village. So everything is done cooperatively. Labor exchanges are the first sort of town-based co-ops where people sort of set up these banks where people get like time tickets in exchange for like doing hours of work. The Rochdale co-op movement starts in 1844 because that's the first time somebody founds a co-op store that doesn't fail. But that's pretty important. The main the main thing about Rochdale is they invented the patronage dividend, which is like the first consumer loyalty program. So that's pretty interesting. They also invented vertically integrated retail because they got together and they formed their own national wholesaler, which is something that none of the private market stores had done, which is one of the reasons they were like enormously successful. And the politics that developed out of the Rochdale movement was the idea of creating a cooperative commonwealth, which is the idea that will actually replace the capitalist economy and even the contemporary nation state with sort of co-ops and federations of co-ops and networks of co-ops. Okay, so there's also this 19th century movement called associated homes, which is basically people hadn't invented like miniaturized washing machines yet. So they're like, how can we get sort of like industrial technology to make domestic work less arduous? And the answer is, well, let's like build big buildings that have big industrial kitchens and big industrial laundries in them, or maybe we'll build a bunch of houses, sort of like the UK Garden City movement, if anyone's heard of that. That was part of this associated homes movement. It'll become obvious why it's important later. The worker co-op movement is sort of like the consumer co-op movement, except for the model was we'll do it through unions instead of through setting up stores. The Knights of Labor is the first major American labor union, basically. And so that's what they were doing. And it's really interesting if you like go online to try to learn about the Knights of Labor, almost no one mentions that they were setting up co-ops, but they actually set up over 300 worker co-ops. And no one remembers this, but it might be kind of important. The other thing, nonprofit associations used to be very different before the rise of the welfare state. They tend to be more like identity-based. And they actually provided things like unemployment insurance, which no one remembers, but it might be kind of important for understanding how student housing co-ops work. I'll explain that in a minute. Okay, so the Cooperative League of the USA. This is like the first thing I'm really going to talk about. So the Co-op League of the USA was set up in 1916 by a guy called Warbasse. And he was really inspired, sort of like Laurent was inspired by the European co-operators. Warbasse was inspired by the UK co-op movement. He was going to try to replicate it in America. So his book, Cooperative Democracy, is basically just, let's do all these great things the Brits are doing, and Scottish people as well. His key concepts: centralization of administration, decentralization of control. That means he thought that AGMs were really important. So he thought like the reason why AGMs are really important is because every consumer member of a co-op should be able to complain about anything about the service provision of like the way goods are sold or the quality of goods, and call out any board member or any committee member or any staff member at these quarterly meetings. And this was really like, this was for him the key sort of element of democracy in cooperatives. He didn't believe in worker self-management. He was actually really opposed to worker self-management. There's historically been this weird conflict between consumer co-ops and worker co-ops, like, that doesn't seem to exist so much anymore, which is maybe due to contemporary cooperative underdevelopment. But anyway, there was this weird thing with the USSR. Like, do you guys know that like Lenin actually forced everyone to become a member of their consumer co-op in 1917? Which is sort of like a weird way of sort of supporting the co-op movement by violating their first principle of voluntary membership. There were weird conflicts between the Co-op League of the USA and the Communist Party in the 1920s, which eventually resulted in Communist Party-aligned members being ejected from the League in 1928. But the thing you have to understand about that is the mainstream Co-op League people, the people who were kicking out the communists, were themselves like hardcore committed anti-capitalists. But they believed in anti-capitalism of like an evolutionary approach, where you're creating a cooperative commonwealth by running really effective businesses, which in a lot of ways are similar to capitalist business, but they're motivated by accountability to consumers rather than shareholders. They really should be doing this as a slideshow, but anyway, I'm just going to keep going here. So in the 30s, there's this big conflict within the Cooperative League. This guy Bowen, I really should make this bigger. How do I do this?
It's like
Present.
Five.
Okay, so this guy Bowen gets control of the organization, and he realizes that the key to expanding the movement is to get the farmers on board. Now, the problem with the farmers is they don't like the radicalism. The reason they don't like the radicalism is because the radicalism involves the consumer co-ops setting up these wholesalers that then buy factories and farms. In fact, it already happened. The CWS, the UK wholesaler, was buying up Canadian farmland in 1910, 1911, scared the crap out of the farmers because they thought that they were going to become like sort of like, you know, like what happened in the Soviet Union, like this kind of thing. Like they really didn't want that. So Bowen told the farmers that I don't believe in this whole socialization of property thing. I'm not going to do that. There was, you know, a lot of conflict that eventually resulted in 1946. There was, I'm really messing this up here. 1946. The CLUSA adopted the recommendations of some internal committee, which ended all talk about anti-capitalism, all talk about socialization of land, all reference to a co-op commonwealth. They even got rid of using the word consumer, because at that time the word consumer had this radical connotation, because the consumer, like, I'm not going to sing the co-op song for you, but it used to say like consumers marching on, sort of like workers marching on, because people thought they were going to take over the economy as consumers. But the farmers didn't like that, so they stopped doing that. The League sort of continued its drift away from the radical cooperative tradition, eventually changed its name to the National Co-op Business Association. And if you look at its mission now, there's no commitment to co-op commonwealth or anything like this. It's just to develop, advance the co-op enterprise. Welcome. You guys here for the conference?
No, this is the wrong lecture, sorry.
No worries, no worries. Okay, so the thing you know, the reason why I'm giving this co-op movement history is because it's in the context of this conflict within the co-op league that the student co-op movement emerges. So there were student co-ops before this, and like there were lots in Texas, and there were some in Northwestern, but it started in the 1870s. But the movement as a movement gets started in the 1930s when Bowen, the guy who was bringing in the farmers, actually organized Toyohiko Kagawa, who was a big figure in the Japanese cooperative movement, to speak at these student Christian movement conferences all across the country. There were at least 6 of these, there may have been more. They were like big deal conferences. It would be like 10 days long where you're like talking about lots of things, but like 1 hour every day would be devoted specifically to talking about cooperation. Like hundreds or thousands of students involved in the student Christian movement attended these conferences. They went back to their co-ops, their conferences, and they started co-ops. Some of those people were from Toronto, and they actually met at Wimblewood Cafe, which is now called Ned's Cafe, for like the whole spring of 1936, or like winter, I suppose. And they actually started CCRI. So like they're actually people who've attended one of these conferences. The students who were like attending these conferences, part of the student Christian movement was a left-wing movement. They were motivated by Christian socialist and Christian social justice ideas. This made them more favorable to the radical view of cooperation. If you read Toyohiko Kagawa, his book, it's very similar to James P. Warbass's book. It's very similar to the 19th century radical British cooperators, but he was doing it in Japan. Okay, so the student co-op movement is really getting going in the 1940s. By 1939, there's 113,000 people in student co-ops in North America. That's not just housing co-ops. By 1941, there's 10,000 members, which is, I think, like not really so different from today. I'm actually not sure if it, keep messing this up. The current numbers. 1946, the National Student Co-op League was founded with support of the Co-op League and also the National Wholesalers. Luther Buckley was the first executive director. He becomes a very important figure later on. 1947, the Canadian Regional Student Co-op Associations, actually they had sort of like local associations, they all disbanded and joined NASCO. Late 1940s, I have specific references to a conference where wholesalers with the Pacific Coast League were actually attending like the orientations of co-ops and telling them like, if you guys like do good in your degree, we'll hire you. So this is important, right? Because it's like, you know, people are more likely to get involved in the movement if they think it's like an avenue to getting a job. So that was more of a thing at that time. Also, the league was, the student league was in regular contract with the League for Industrial Democracy, which becomes important later. So the league really like wanes in the 1950s, but it's okay because Luther has a job. He gets a job with ICC Ann Arbor. The league and NASCO, like the Co-op League and the Student League, they both lobby the American government, and they manage to get like HUD funding, which is sort of like national funding. isn't implemented until later, but 57 is when they first got it. The early 60s, ICC Ann Arbor was crucial to the founding of Students for a Democratic Society, which is sort of like the big activist student power group in the 1960s. Luther Bufley, the original executive director of NASCL, plays this key role in founding SDS because he was in contact with members of this group called the League for Industrial Democracy in the 40s and 50s, and he introduced those people to these student organizers, and this was sort of like a key point of power building in the student power movement in the 60s. 1964, Howard Edelman, that Jack spoke about, and from back in the 60s, he actually lobbied the Canadian government to release CMHC funding for Canadian student housing co-ops, which is how we built Rochdale and Neil Isaac and some other co-ops that we don't have anymore. The 60s were generally good for the co-op movement, like activist energy was drawn towards the co-op movement. There was actually a house in Ann Arbor called the Nonviolent Coordinating Committee House that was like an important group at the time. And it's sort of interesting contrast to Jack's point about that sort of antagonistic meeting at Har House. In 1967, there was a meeting in Ann Arbor where there was a unanimous vote in favor of raising charges by 20% so they could do the North Campus development and sort of like double the size of their co-ops. So it was, different energy in the air, I suppose. So the current most important student co-op organization is North American Students for Cooperation, originally formed as the North American Student Co-op Organization in 1968. And this, I think it's sort of relevant to note that it was formed in the context of the fragmentation of SDS. SDS was sort of like going in different directions. There's some like Leninist factions, but like it seems to me that a bunch of the energy, and like this is early terms of research of this, a bunch of the energy that was going into the student movement was sort of like redirected back into the co-op movement. NASCO held a huge amount of conferences in these early years, mostly regional conferences, including the conference in Toronto in 1971 that had over 1,000 people attending. NASCO's annual institute begins, so things become a little bit more normal in 1977. We changed our name to North American Students for Cooperation in 1978, mostly because we'd sort of done this deal where we became the main trainer of the new wave food co-ops. But I actually think that's significant because why was it that these non-student co-ops wanted to be part of the student co-op organization? So I'll talk about that in a second. 1988, NASCO Properties was founded, so NASCO becomes actually its own kind of a wholesaler. We own property and then rent it back to our members. 2000s, NASCO funds the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops. So that sort of signals an end to this sort of a conflict between the consumer co-op and worker co-op movement, at least within certain segments of the consumer co-op movement. So now I just want to show you a lot of pretty pictures of, so when I talk about the movement, I'm talking about a lot of co-ops. So for example, I'm not going to go through, I see Austin, by the way, they sent 40% of their membership to NASCO Institute this year. 40% of their membership. So they must be doing something, because that's not member apathy. College houses, Paul used to live here. MCC is a really wonderful co-op. Berkeley is the biggest. Santa Barbara, Boulder, they just lobbied to actually change the legal rules about how people are allowed to live together, which is I think the first time that's happened. Riverton has a huge building they built on the site of an old dining co-op, which they didn't need anymore, which is a cool idea. Neil Isaac used to have this great mural. Did you guys know about this, by the way? It's not there anymore, right?
It's there. There's a condo.
Oh, well, anyway, I just think we should bask in the great mural. A lot of co-ops and a lot of them are, we're all still here. Okay, so what do the buildings of all these co-ops have in common? Well, obviously they're all different, but I think you can make a sort of generalization. A lot of them are built in these old mansions of 12 to 15 or more people. They almost all have some kind of industrial kitchen space, and they usually have some kind of member-run meal plan. So that's sort of the associated homes movement. They often have brightly colored, distinctive appearances, and they often have signs identifying their co-op identity, which contributing the strong sense of member identity, which sort of recalls mutual benefit societies and sort of pre-welfare state nonprofits. What do the co-ops have in common? I'm not going to talk about that. What is cooperation? So there's been different periods of cooperation. There's been different cooperative movements. Actually, I would say cooperation sort of means something different to these different movements. For Owen, cooperation meant setting up these new villages, which were prefiguring a new moral society. For the Rochdale movement and the Co-op League, it meant taking over the economy by running these really efficient stores. For the Knights of Labor, it meant doing the same thing but with unions and worker co-ops. And for after the co-ops make their peace with capitalism, it's all about promoting the co-op model. And these are actually there's tension between these four visions. They're not the same vision. But what is cooperation according to the student housing co-op movement? Well, I I would say the really interesting thing about student housing co-ops is they actually have elements of all of these different kinds of co-ops in them. So like, they're sort of like villages, because they probably have like a bike repair shop and a kitchen and all these different things. They're definitely consumer co-ops, because that's the basic structure, they're owned by their members. But like Jim Jones has told me, like, they're also worker co-ops, because we expect our members to work. Even Neil Isaac, like, you expect your members to do some work, but they're not really like worker co-ops, because the members don't get paid. So they're actually sort of like labor exchanges, because everyone's expected to do the same amount of work. So this is sort of like univocity of treating different people's labor. And they're also, like, I think the associated homes movement is sort of an interesting precursor in the sense of like this sort of industrial approach to housework that happens at most SHCs. So like my sort of thesis out of this is that the student housing co-op movement, or like NASCO more specifically, to some extent retains aspects of this sort of like radical vision of cooperation, which was sort of like pushed out of the mainstream co-op movement in 1946 and then like later in Canada as well. But this is actually like a really like controversial thesis, because not all of the student housing co-ops have shown commitment to the more radical vision. There's ongoing conflict within the student housing co-op movement over whether we should be committed to constant expansion, over this issue of like students versus non-students, which I didn't really talk about, over anti-oppression politics, which I think you can sort of see as today's version of the social reform question, which Owen was dealing with in terms of like whether traditional religion or traditional marriage were like things that we should be supporting. So like, for example, like it's been said that sometimes the language that certain co-op conferences use around anti-oppression is alienating to some people, and this sort of like, I think this is sort of like an element of that old social reform question re-emerging. So that, I'm sorry, I probably went over time, but like, sorry. Okay, but like that's it. So here's a bunch of books you should read, and actually here's like some movies that you can watch, and they're all really fun, and you can learn more about co-ops. Thanks.